You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, we talked to him last week about his book on the Eastern Front. He has most graciously decided to come back on the podcast to discuss his phenomenal book. I enjoyed it so much. I read it with great intent. The Western Front, A History of the Great War, 1914-1918. Dr. Nick Lloyd, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The Western Front, or World War I in general, the Western Front has been covered and covered and covered. But you managed to discover and articulate new things about that half of the conflict, that side of the conflict. How difficult was it for you to write a different perspective?
I mean, it wasn't necessarily. I mean, it's difficult in a number of ways, but I think it's become evident over the years that certainly in Britain, our view of the Western Front is very Anglo-centric, and it doesn't take into consideration the breadth of that front. So we don't tend to think too much about, for example, the French army and its experience on the Western Front, and how that interacts with the German army. And so it was very early on in the project that I thought, the existing histories of the Western Front, there aren't actually that many, obviously very heavily focused on the British Army, which is fine. And that's a development, we've had to go through. But I think there's been quite a lot of excellent work over the last 10 or 15 years on different aspects of the Western Front, on the German army, and particularly on the French experience, that I wanted to incorporate and bring a much more rounded and coherent story to the Western Front than the one that even if you're an Englishman and you've read a bit on the war, your war is obviously grounded in the British Expeditionary Force, and that's the kind of Western Front that we know. And so widening it out, particularly to the French, also to the Americans as well, and then to the other side, I think that was really the aim, was to bring it out and incorporate all the scholarship that has been done in recent decades that I think provides that different perspective. And so it was a conscious decision to try and incorporate a broader perspective, which I knew people have been working on, and I knew there had been lots of interesting stuff on the Western Front, but it hadn't really crossed over into the popular sort of conception of the war. And that, I think I'm very, very proud of the book in that sense, that people read it. And if you look at some of the reviews and some of the comments people have had, certainly the French story seems to be the most surprising thing to them. They read it and then they write quite excitedly about, I didn't realize the French did this and the French did that. And I think that's really, really important.
Sticking with the French for just a second, is there a sense of when people say, I didn't know that, would it be accurate to say the French experience in the Great War is overshadowed by the French experience in the Second World War, and therefore they're just kind of just dismissed as a group?
I mean, I think it is, and it is. And I mean, obviously the trauma of the Second World War and the collapse of 1940 as a deep scar in France's history and French psyche. But so much of the damage of 1940, the rot, comes from the First World War, the enormous sacrifice that the French army and the French people made. And so I think there's no real way of understanding the Western Front without looking at what the French went through. And I think that's a really important component of getting it right. And so actually balancing it out in our understanding. And so really the Western Front really is the story of France's war. That's the sort of predominant story in the book. I mean, the British are obviously involved, and the British become more important as the war goes on, as their army expands. But it is really the French story of how they're able to hang on in 1914 and then carry on through the war. And so I think that's what makes it such an interesting story is these individuals and these generals and these characters come back and try and win it. So you can't really understand the Western Front without looking at the French experience. Helps put the Brits in context, really.
Is it fair to say that the Brits, if I may use that term here in the United States, the Brits' commitment to being on the continent with a large army was somewhat fueled by the tenacity and the resistance and the bravery of the French?
Yeah, I mean, the British obviously don't initially, they send a very small expeditionary force in August of 1914, essentially to provide moral support to the French and to secure the left flank of the French army. And then the British are faced with that situation that the war is far bigger than they had anticipated, and they get dragged in. And so really they have no choice but to reinforce that army and to expand it and grow it to try and, survive on the Western Front. And so the story of that relationship and that coalition war is one fraught with difficulties. And I detail in the book all the conferences they had and the disagreements they have and all the tensions within that relationship where the French want to bring the Brits on and they want more British, and the Brits are trying to hold the line and not have a sort of open-ended commitment to the West. And ultimately, they make a commitment by late 1915, early 1916. There is a commitment by Britain to actually see the thing through, but relations between the two camps are never harmonious. And by 1918, you kind of have a working relationship that's much better. And I think that's one of the themes of the book is you see that relationship develop, but it's never an easy one. And the Brits aren't really happy with it, certainly by the end of it. There's a feeling that either been used by the French or it wasn't really the war that they wanted to fight. And, next time it will be different. Whereas the French feeling is actually that we're taking all the blood cost of this war. We're doing all the fighting, and the Brits are not really playing the game. The British will counter and say, well, actually, we've got a massive navy that's blockading the Central Powers, that's bringing in the food and supplies and is securing your armies. And we're actually taking on most of the war against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So there is a balance there. But the French, from their perspective, never really understand that or see that because, well, their war is predominantly in France. And so if the story of the Western Front is anything, it's a story of French resistance and French trying to, hold off that, German onslaught.
What is more surprising to you as a military historian, as a historian, that allies fight each other or that they figure it out and learn how to fight with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the story of a sort of coalition which is formed by 1918, and there's that relationship between those key players: Haig, Pétain, Foch, Pershing, Nivelle. I mean, there's quite a few characters that come and go during the course of the war, and they're able to forge a relationship, and it's a kind of a fellowship that gets there in the end when they appoint Foch as Allied Generalissimo under the threat of disintegration and defeat in spring of 1918. They finally get there. That's a key moment where they actually realize that actually if we don't do this, if we don't conform our armies much more tightly, and if we actually don't do this, the two armies will split and the Germans will win. And so that's the moment where they have no alternative but to actually rely on each other in a much more comprehensive way. With the creation of the Supreme War Council, and particularly Foch's leadership is crucial because they have to, they come to that realization that if they don't, they are going to be defeated. And so I think there's that, things come full circle. There's times of the war where the French do their own thing and they don't really interested in the British, and there's times where the British do their own thing and they're not interested in the French. By 1918, they no longer can do that. They have to work together. And then you get quite remarkable scenes in 1918 where British and French divisions are almost interchangeable, fighting alongside each other. And there's some great photographs from 1918 where you see, like a wounded German soldier being carried by on a stretcher, and there's a Frenchman, and there's a British soldier, and they're all operating very, very, really together. And I think that is indication of just how far the British and French had come by 1918.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dr. Nick Lloyd. We're discussing his book, The Western Front, A History of the Great War, 1914-1918. It has received terrific reviews, not only from the press, but also from historians, including Andrew Roberts. He's a pretty smart guy, I think. Wonderful comments. James McPherson, who's one of the greatest Civil War historians, American Civil War historians who ever lived. And also, and you wouldn't know this per se, but also a former podcast guest of ours, and that is Gareth Russell, said your books were magnificent in a private conversation with me. So the accolades keep going in.
Yeah, what can I say? Everyone's very, very kind. I was very pleased with the James McPherson quote. I mean, obviously he's a historian I admire greatly, so it's just really, really humbling to get these big names say nice things about you, and you're just sort of waiting for it, and it's great.
Well, I don't know how many books of McPherson's I've read, a dozen maybe. He's so brilliant, but part of it is a testament to, I cannot imagine how much work and the thousands of hours that go into writing a book such as yours, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. How is that process something that keeps you going? In other words, that you just don't go, God, I can't take any more of Passchendaele. I've had it.
Of fascination, for many years, obsession probably. I've studied the Great War all my sort of adult life, really, and going back to my teenage years, it was always a fascination, and studied it professionally. Had the good fortune to become a historian, and you get to a point, I think, a kind of maturity in yourself, but also in your writing, where you can kind of handle these bigger topics and the larger sorting of material. And so, when I came to the Western Front, I knew the ground pretty well. I knew the literature. I'd been researching and writing it, so it was an expansion of what I'd known. And so it was kind of using all the stuff that I'd learned, but also trying to write in a way, which is something I've honed throughout my career, trying to write in a way that is people can understand and can appreciate. Because I think too much of history, I think certainly I read, is quite flat, and you never really get a sense of the characters involved. So much of history is about personal relationships and personal characters, which you really need to understand. All the military history is just full of units, the movement of units, which can be very, very difficult to digest. And so, there is a movement of units in my book, but I hope it's not too much. And I really wanted to nail the characters of these individuals. So that was a real challenge. Some of them I knew better than others, but some I got to know over the course of the book. Some I disliked, some I really liked. And so I think that was really a challenging part of the book, was to bring these characters to life. But I mean, it was a great joy to write. I mean, it was a fascinating story to write, and you just sort of plod through it. And I think the seasons come and go, and one of the things I really wanted to do was was just go through the sort of timeline, so you don't get to a period where fighting's finished for the year. So then you kind of, you move immediately to the following spring and you start again. So we actually go through the winters, and you can kind of have a breather, and then you go again. And that sense of just moving gradually with the time was really crucial. So yeah, I mean, I think it was just about sort of trying to get into characters and sort of immerse yourself in it, which is really interesting to do. But I mean, I can do it because that's pretty much all I do.
You mentioned, I can't let this pass, so forgive me. You mentioned characters you like and disliked. You want to give the audience one or two of each, or one of each?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of French generals that I really admired and I really came to like. Philippe Pétain, I think, certainly, I mean, obviously his history in the Second World War is more so we say more complex. But certainly in the First World War, he's a national hero and a great man. There were other characters I like Robert Nivelle. I think is good at certain points, but he just loses it. There were some commanders like General Herbert Plumer, Henry Rawlinson on the British side that I thought were excellent battlefield commanders. There's some characters you really dislike. So someone like Erich Ludendorff, a very difficult character, very sort of a very aggressive, but actually really narrow in his conception of war, not willing to compromise on anything. And so there were others that, you want to do well and they just don't get it. And there are others that do come good in the end. So someone like Foch, Ferdinand Foch, I think comes good in the end and understands it. So I didn't want to be too critical on these men. I think, that's maybe one of the other themes of the book is, all the generals of the First World War, they're all kind of donkeys and all kind of butchers and bunglers. I mean, that's such a popular kind of meme, really. I mean, it's a cliche now, but I think just to try and understand some of these people on their own grounds so that people can make their own minds up, because, yeah, many of them made mistakes, but the stakes were so enormous that it was very easy to go wrong on the Western Front.
You led me perfectly into my next question, and that is so much that's written about World War II references World War One. The trenches, coalition warfare, the war, the tactics of maneuver. And there's clearly a relationship. But what's the relationship of the Great War to previous conflicts? Let's say 50 years previous. And obviously I'm thinking of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 71. Was there anything that happened in the previous, let's say, generation or two that informed how World War One was fought?
I mean, there's many things. I mean, the Germans think they're going to do the Franco-Prussian War too, really. It'll be a similarly swift and decisive operation. The French are determined that it won't be, and so the French are much better prepared this time around. I think, there are a number of lessons, both good and bad, that they've taken from previous wars. They understand the power of modern weaponry, but the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-95, there's a sense that, yes, the technology is very lethal, but if you have troops that are possessed of a certain amount of offensive spirit in a land, they can gain ground. And so there's a sense that actually, because of the Japanese experience, we can do it as well. There are others, some like Herbert Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War. He's influenced by, the American Civil War and the kind of long duration of that, and kind of tells his colleagues in London, actually, this is probably going to last at least 3 years, which is something they really don't want to hear. And so there are many kind of echoes of previous campaigns that they're looking at and trying to apply those lessons. Jomini, of course, the lesson of interior lines and sort of the geography of battle is a crucial part of the mental furniture of the generals of the time. As is Napoleon, the long influence of Napoleon through the 19th century is still there. The British go to war with more experience than anybody else in terms of recent conflict with the South African War. So there's lots of things the British apply from that war, particularly in terms of fieldcraft, in terms of sort of almost like camouflage. Their uniforms are very good, rifles are good. So there's lots of tactical things as well as broader things that all the armies bring to 1914. But of course, it's just sheer lethality and shock of battle that they can't really appreciate, because it's just so much more lethal, so many more troops, and it's so much more a higher tempo that the shock of it is quite profound, and they just cannot work out how this is going to go. And so it is, and that shock doesn't really dissipate until really 1916.
The most famous strategic military plan in history is the Schlieffen Plan, developed by the Imperial German General Staff. Please tell me if you don't think it's the most famous. I do. Here in the United States, we have the Anaconda Plan, which was Winfield Scott's plan to win the American Civil War. But the Schlieffen Plan, it eventually was not implemented. I'm going to ask you what it was. Could it have worked? And was it actually implemented in the way it was originally designed?
This has been the subject of much debate, particularly among German military officers in the interwar period, where they were trying to work out what had gone wrong. Now, Moltke, who's the commander that takes the army to war in 1914, is kind of blamed because he kind of weakens the right wing. So the right wing should be the strongest element, should be like a door moving through Belgium and the Low Countries. And so he reduces the odds. So instead of being like 7-1 on the right wing, it becomes effectively 3-1. So he sends more reserves to his center and his left. So Moltke is often accused of not doing the Schlieffen Plan in the spirit of which it was originally maintained, where there would be always a preponderance of force on the right. So he would always outflank the enemy. Moltke moved things around for various reasons. He didn't want to invade he didn't want to invade Holland. And he's aware of French movements and French. He's nervous about allowing an invasion of Germany, keeping their defenses too light on the left. So there are various reasons why he moves it. Ultimately, whether the Schlieffen Plan was ever really workable, I'm not sure, because there's simply no way that you can keep that movement going quicker than the French can move. Huge amounts of railway deployment prior to when they go, so they move everyone in place on a railways, and once the Germans get off their railheads, they really march. They just march. So they're marching and marching and marching and marching day after day after day after day in that sun, 10, 15 miles a day, sometimes 20 miles a day. And so by, late August, they are absolutely blown. I mean, they are absolutely exhausted. Whereas the French make extensive use of their railways to move divisions around. And so the French can redeploy much quicker. And so even if they'd had more troops on the right, I still think the French survive in 1914 and are able to counter. But, you're free to play these war games and counterfactuals, and it's always fascinating to see if they would have won in 1914. But the historians I've spoken to and the way I've done, I think the French have enough in 1914 to survive. So even if you kind of replay the Schlieffen Plan in the way that maybe Schlieffen would have done it, I still think French can redeploy quicker. And eventually the Germans are just going to slow down. They're not going to be able to put. I'm always amazed by one of the things I learned was when the German First Army, the strongest army, hit the British at Mons on the 23rd of August 1914. Its rearward elements, parts of its divisions and regiments, are still filing out of their barracks in Germany. So they haven't actually fully deployed the army because they can't deploy it all. So there's only a fraction of that army that's actually able to make contact because 80-90% of it is still on the roads through Belgium. And so you can see the logistical and supply issues you would have by doing the Schlieffen Plan. There simply isn't the route, and there isn't the supplies, and there isn't the vehicular support to actually move quicker than the enemy. So it's a long way of saying I think that the Schlieffen Plan really couldn't really have worked. And the crucial problem with the Schlieffen Plan wasn't necessarily the tactical or the operational problem. It was the very fact that it was a strategic answer to a problem that caused huge problems. So you don't want to fight a two-front war. So instead of maybe using diplomacy or only fighting a one-front war, the Schlieffen Plan is enacted, which means you bring in everybody else. So it's quite insane in that situation. It's an operational problem.
Yeah. Operational solution to a strategic problem.
And of course, the strategic ramifications of going through Belgium, invading in the West are just profound.
The failure of the Schlieffen Plan leads to the Battle of the Marne, which is in early September 1914. The French win that battle, which begins and I'm being very general here, the trench warfare on the Western Front that we're so familiar with through the years. Was part of the French, the British, and the German sort of battle plans. Did any of those countries foresee trench warfare?
Not really. They'd experienced, the British had experienced a little bit in places in South Africa. You do have trench warfare in the Far East in the Russo-Japanese War, where it had been seen and noted. But there is an assumption that war will be short, decisive. Now, there are some dissenters from this, but broadly that's the idea. And anyway, that's what you want. You want short, sharp, decisive battle on all sides. Now, the Germans are better equipped for trench warfare because they carry more medium and heavy artillery. And they do this because they're going to have to go through fortifications, Belgian forts, Belgian belts of fortifications. So they're going to need that weight of power. Whereas the French army don't really have that much because it's all about maneuver and speed, and the British don't have much at all because the British don't fight in a heavy way. It's an expeditionary force that's light and can maneuver. So trench warfare is not envisaged, and it's a sort of horror movie that nobody wants to watch. It's something that they can't really to understand and apply. And you don't plan for trench warfare. Trench warfare is essentially seen as a kind of strategic defeat in a way. So you can't really plan for it in that sense. So it has to be responded to in an ad hoc way.
Let me ask a question. I skipped over my own notes, and forgive me for wanting to go back just a few seconds. In your view, was the Western Front decided, or logically there was a continuum between the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, the French victory at the Battle of the Marne, and ultimate German defeat?
I think it's a difficult question, and I think clearly the bid for victory in 1914 fails. Germany can't win in 1914. It doesn't win. And so does that mean Germany loses the war? I don't think that's true at all. I think, there's still plenty that can happen, in the next 3-4 years, and Germany is still extremely powerful. So I think, had things gone differently, Germany may well have had a stalemate in the West, but it effectively wins everywhere else. It wins in the East, wins in the Balkans, it can defeat the Italians, and so they can win everywhere else. The problem is the German high command's inability to actually transform these victories into a strategic and political outcome that is broadly satisfactory. And so that's the problem. So, had Germany wins everywhere, it fights other than in the West. Now, clearly the West is the decisive theatre of war. But you certainly, I think, if the Germans had made much more of a serious effort at peace in 1916 or 1917, say, going back to 1914 borders. Now, for example, I realize that may well have been hard for the German high command to admit. I understand that. But for example, if they had have done that, that would have been very difficult for the British and French to keep fighting. Now, they might have wanted to, but realistically, I think it becomes very, very difficult, much more difficult politically, to justify the continued slaughter when the Germans are saying, well, we can withdraw. But, these are counterfactuals that are very difficult to answer. Indeed impossible. But I think there's so much that can happen even after the Marne. I don't think the Germans are condemned to defeat at all. I think the Germans are a number of avenues out that, even if they don't have a complete total victory, they have a very, very strong position coming out.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Nick Lloyd, author of the brilliant book, The Western Front, part of his history of the Great War, 1914, 1918. Dr. Lloyd, is there a particular event during the Great War you wish you had witnessed, been there as it was happening?
Yeah, there are obviously lots of incidents. I wouldn't necessarily want to see the battlefields because I can imagine there will be, for example, the Western Front would have been so horrifying as to be almost unimaginable. You can imagine the Somme on that terrible first day. It's such a terrible day. It would. So yeah, I think there's people I would have liked to have met. I would have liked to have been there at the Doullens town hall when they appoint Foch as Generalissimo, or in the German high command in Mons in 1918, where they admit defeat. There's all kinds of moments where you would have been very interesting to see the dynamics of the individuals involved. But no, I think the battlefields would have been a horrendous situation. So, but it's a very interesting question. I think the book I'm working on at the moment the sort of final volume, and there's plenty of times you would have, I would have liked to have been in Jerusalem on the 9th of December when Allenby walks through after the conquering. That would have been pretty special.
You've mentioned this a few times, and I want to go back to something that you said about how you approach this book, how it's different. Scholarship obviously changes, during the decades. Emphasis waxes and wanes on particular aspects. Your book made me think that the worst place to ever be in the history of the world was the Western Front during the Great War. How did you just said a few seconds ago about the tremendous slaughter. Try to put that in context for us. And why was it so important for you to detail, this is what Adam Smith from Glasgow or, Nick Lloyd from Indianapolis dealt with every single day?
I mean, I think the First World War is just, it's that sort of, abiding catastrophe, really. And I think that's always sort of been of great interest because it's such a disastrous war, such a tragic war, destruction of European Western civilization in many ways that unleashes so many of the horrors of the 20th century, the ethnic cleansing, seas of great genocides, Russian Revolution, the horrors of Soviet communism, the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. And I mean, the list goes on. I mean, it's a great tragedy. And I think that's what's very interesting about it. I mean, I think the book doesn't necessarily dwell on the common soldier all that much. I mean, there's plenty of books that will tell you about what it was like to be in a trench. I have some of that. But I think mine is more about that sort of what is actually happening and why certain battles are taking place and what do they mean and why victory comes when it comes. And so I think it's about those key individuals that are trying to find their way out of the great maelstrom. And I think you learn a lot about individuals when you see them, making mistakes, doing, things they shouldn't have done or stupid things or trying their best and still failing. I think that's a great lesson for everybody to see how humans, can continue to keep going in the most terrible circumstances. And so, again, the personal stories of those people were very important to me. And I think that's that's a glue, really, to see how these people are getting on. And I think, people will hopefully come through the book and, have their own favorites or villains or that kind of thing. And that's fine. That's fine. I think it offers that to them.
On the Allied side, and I hate to use this term, so forgive me, it seems the most enduring villain is General Douglas Haig of the British. Is that a fair description? And is that a fair historical conclusion? Because it seems to me that so much of what you wrote about in your book, and you just articulated it, was they just can't figure it out. It's so massive. It's so bloody. In some cases, it's so new. Machine guns obviously had been around for decades, but not deployed in these numbers. Now you have airplanes. Now you have tanks. Now you have unrestricted submarine warfare. There just seem to be very smart and well considered men and leaders who just were frustrated that they couldn't figure out a way to win it, end it, however it was going to conclude. First, about Haig, his reputation waxes, it was pretty good, gets worse. How do you feel about him? And just in general, as you said a few seconds ago, these leaders trying to figure it out?
I mean, Haig has probably got the worst reputation of any British general in history. And it's been the subject of many biographies and much common disdain, vitriol, abuse, as well as, some historians that have tried to defend him, most notably John Terraine with his Educated Soldier book, 1963. I think Haig has strengths. He's a good organizer. He's firm. He's solid. He doesn't waver. He doesn't have a nervous breakdown. Keeps going. He works very hard. Speaks French quite good operating in a coalition, is able to support and push forward new technology like the tank, like gas, like the air power. He's interested in new kit and he wants to use it. But that's balanced out by, I think, significant shortfalls and shortcomings in himself. And I think one of the problems Haig has is he is he is convinced that he doesn't really have anything to learn, which is a crucial fact. He comes to the Western Front thinking, well, I know about war. I've been educated and trained. I've seen it. So therefore, whatever happens out there must conform to my understanding of what war is about and maneuver. And this is why he's very distrustful of anything that doesn't conform to his set ideas about what warfare should be. So decisive battle. So Haig is always trying to fight a decisive engagement, a decisive battle. And I think a number of other commanders, often slightly lower down the chain of command, have kind of drawn away from that. So by the end of 1915, a lot of certainly French commanders have said, well, actually, now we can't have a decisive battle. So we have to fight on attritional. We have to fight attritional battle for the time being. We have to find a way of fighting that reduces our risk to our men and poses greater risks to Germany. And so Haig never agrees with this. So he's always trying to fight a decisive battle when he can never win one. And so I think that's a crucial component of my criticism of Haig, is that there are other commanders that take a much more open-minded approach to what they see. And that means they can be more kind of open about different operational methods that they might use to survive on the battlefield. And so, without going into too much detail, but you see this development both in France and in Britain of this idea of a bite and hold, or of a limited attack based on artillery firepower to bite off sections of the front and then, gradually chew through the enemy's defenses with keeping the risk, keeping casualties as low as possible. But Haig never fights in this way. He's always aiming to be far more over-optimistic about what they can do. And so it's quite ironic that Haig always has this reputation as being this kind of stolid, attritional general. And he never really fights an attritional battle. He's trying to have maneuver and breakthrough when it's simply not possible. And now that's the main critique of Haig, I think, that certainly I've and others have made. But I think he's one that doesn't necessarily really adapt to the war in a way that other commanders do. So by 1918, you have a cadre of really solid operational commanders, both in France and Britain, that know what men are capable of on the First World War battlefield. They know what can be achieved, and that informs what they want to do. Whereas you get a sense, Haig never really understands what troops are actually capable of in an industrial battlefield. And that is a problem, I think.
Let's switch a little bit and talk about Imperial Germany. We discussed the Russian front in the previous podcast. We don't want to spend any time or much time on that. And I think I asked you this question in the previous one, but I'm going to ask it again. Is it one of the most remarkable things to me when reading about the Great War is the strength of Imperial Germany and the fact that it took on, at the time, 3 of the 4 biggest empires, industrial countries in the world, and came within a dice throw or a whisker of winning the conflict, and that they were able to overcome the two-front war, which they were always scared of, through the use of interior lines. I'm not going to ask you, tell me about Imperial Germany during the Great War. I won't do that to you. But did you have some general observations about the German command, the role of the Kaiser, and just how Germany was able to last as long as it did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a remarkable achievement in many ways. Everything in Germany, certainly the army, is all about tactical competence and tactical effectiveness. So the way that they do command and control, the weapon systems, the training, it's a very coherent state, general high level of education. And so that means it gives it a real stolidity. And it's a big army as well. So there's lots of people that are trained up. whereas Britain doesn't have that. It's training on the job. But I mean, ultimately, the Germans are in quite a favorable position because they're on the strategic offense in France. They're in France, but they're on the defensive tactically and operationally. And in that early phase of the war, where there is a real advantage to the defense, that gives them that ability to withstand and hold the line and then learn about the war, and they can try other things in the east. But again, you've got to remember that about a third of the German army is in the east, so there's only two-thirds in the west, and so Germany is an extremely powerful state. It's significantly bigger than France, and it has. One historian said it has the most, the greatest army since the Roman legions, and I think that's a really interesting point, certainly in this period of the war. Not to say they get everything right, because I don't think they do, and I think the what the Allies do is in some ways equally impressive, but Germany is able to, has the advantage in the West that it can step back and actually give up terrain if it needs to, and present that problems for the Allies while trying to win the war elsewhere. And so Germany is able to do that pretty successfully until 1918.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about could the war have ended in 1516 or 1617, a diplomatic solution. You mentioned it in your book, and I've read a couple of other books about this. Was there any realistic chance for a diplomatic end to the war, sort of status quo ante? Was it ever going to happen? Could it ever have happened?
I mean, some people have argued that it came close to working out. I'm not sure, really. I think the only time the Germans are really interested in a peace settlement is when they're losing, when they're obviously losing. That's when they start thinking about, well, now is the time. And of course, you don't go for peace because you think you can still win. And most of the time, the British and French and the Germans on the other side still think they can win, really, until you get to a point where, there's that line in Macbeth, you've waded through so much blood, you might as well just keep going. And I think both sides have that. As more people are killed, there's that sense, well, we can't possibly give up now because,
Right.
how are we going to explain this? And so certainly by 17, that winter of 1617 may be the best chance because the Allies are becoming increasingly exhausted, and Germany is becoming aware that the war is becoming really, really costly. So the end of the Somme going into 1917 is probably the worst period of the war for the Allies, where morale is becoming seriously damaged and Britain's running out of money. But of course, it could have happened had Germany not gone for unrestricted submarine warfare, because once the Americans come in April, that's such a huge boost to the Allied morale. They know they can win now, so they just have to hold on. So once you get to that point, the Allies aren't really interested in anything else. And for Germany's perspective, they never really consider giving up Belgium, withdrawing the borders until it's too late. But had Germany offered something like that at the beginning of 1918, maybe, it wins in the East, it brings all its troops back, and then it digs in, and then it offers serious talks. That would have been really not easy for the Allies to deal with diplomatically.
I'm going to ask you about that in just a second, but I cannot pass up the opportunity. We mentioned and discussed Douglas Haig's status as quote unquote the villain of the Allies, and that's going to overstate it, but you understand where I'm headed. The demonization of the Kaiser as the bloodthirsty Prussian who allows war to happen. And we haven't really talked much about the origin of the war because that's another 5 podcasts. It's so fascinating. But the Kaiser, what was his role as supreme warlord? I think that was his title. And has history been fair to him? Does he deserve his place in the pantheon of historical villains?
I mean, I think he probably does. I mean, he is the man that should, should provide that leadership, and I think he fails on a number of occasions to do that. So, I mean, he's weak. I think that's been well established. He's quite insecure. He says something quite early in the war. He says, people think that I run the war, but it's not true. I just go for walks and chop wood. I just sort of hang around the headquarters and occasionally get briefings. I don't really do anything. And so he's not of the character or the personality or the skill, the political ability to control and cohere the political, economic war and the military war. So the military in Germany becomes so powerful, they basically kind of overshadow him. And so he should have provided that direction and that coordinating function. But he can't do it. And at crucial times, he sort of lacks the courage to take on the generals and actually, put them in their place, because he really is overshadowed by these key figures that are quite happy to essentially bully him into it. But ultimately, he has responsibility, and he does intervene at crucial moments on crucial decisions. But he ultimately is kind of a pathetic character, really, who's completely overshadowed and overwhelmed by the war.
Is it overstating it to assert that the declaration of war by the United States on April 6th, 1917, that's the dispositive event of the war? In other words, at this point, it's decided. Am I being too much of an American here?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, I think that's the moment where it's such a disastrous move from the German high command. Now, clearly, the German high command don't rate the Americans. They don't think they're soldiers. But it's such a risky diplomatic thing to bring. I mean, even if the Americans never deploy an army, that economic power, that military, that naval power is so enormous. I mean, I think even in 1914, American production of coal was like 3 times Germany. So even in 1914, the American economy was absolutely enormous. And that's not as powerful as it later becomes in the 20th century. So there isn't really any doubt about that. It's highly risky, it's highly dangerous, and it's sort of bordering on insanity that at that point in the war, Germany would risk alienating such a powerful opponent. And now, clearly, the question once the Americans come in is, are they going to be able to deploy an army? Germany thinks it can sink everything, and the Americans aren't serious. But again, that's such an underestimation of the American character, of the ability of the British to keep those ships afloat and convoying and everything. So, I mean, I think fundamentally it is a German arrogance. There's a complete arrogance about the Americans, and an ignorance about what the Americans are capable of that ultimately condemns them. And had German high command been led by people with a little bit more of a wider experience of the world, they would have made it clear that diplomatic and political activity is such an important element of the war. We need to think carefully about what we can realistically get away from, get out of the war. Can we have a complete, total, annihilating victory out of all of our opponents? And the answer to that is absolutely not.
Isn't it Ludendorff who says we cannot fight the entire world?
I mean, they say that when they kind of realize the Americans are serious, and I think that's a crucial point of the war. But very quickly, the American entry sort of skews the Germans, because they realize there's a time limit now, and sooner or later the Americans are going to win the war. The question is, can they win it in the intervening period? So that rapidly puts a limit on what Germany can do and puts a time frame on it. So even though the Americans haven't set foot in France, it's already having a kind of warping effect on German strategy. But German strategy is completely, it's all over the place. It's really not coherent. Whereas Allied strategy, you see this as the war goes on, gets much better at working together, allocating resources, allocating production, allocating payments and financial support, and much better combined military and political decision making. However painful it was, they get their political and military elites together and they work out a strategy for victory. Whereas Germany, it's all on the throw of a dice on the battlefield. And so you do see that actually by the end of it, even though the German army is very, very good, the way of fusing military, economic, diplomatic, propaganda, all these elements of war together, the Allies are much better.
As a historian, can you make the case for the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans later in the war? Is there a case? You take us through the arguments in your book, and I really enjoyed that part of it, that discussion. But it's easy to say that it's stupid and, oh my God, what are you doing? You can't antagonize the Americans, even though, they got their hand on the scale of the Allies. They're clearly helping them. They're helping Britain's, stay alive financially. The list goes on. But actually, declaration of war, is it fair to say that's a direct result of unrestricted submarine warfare? And from the German perspective, could you make the case that, hey, we've got to do this? We've tried everything else.
I mean, obviously, it's also combined with trying to bring Mexico in as well, which is sort of completely cack-handed diplomacy. I mean, it's just sort of laughable, really, that the way they try and do it. Which, of course, the British, have cracked those diplomatic cables straight away, and so then the British naval intelligence has that interesting conversation about, what we're going to do with this interesting telegram we've got. So, I mean, there's a combination of things, but I think that shows the sort of ineptness of German strategy making at the highest level. It's very, very inept. I think the German submarine campaign is based upon everything going right. So these are our projections for how many ships we will sink and that this will crush Britain. That's assuming everything goes right and you can achieve everything you want and they don't respond in a way that might reduce your effectiveness. And again, that is a very bad strategy making. If your strategy making is based on everything going right all the time, then that really is very vulnerable to friction, Clausewitzian friction. And again, it's the same with Schlieffen Plan. It will work if everything goes right and the enemy doesn't respond or doesn't do something crazy or different. And so that indicates a kind of, a really poor way of making these decisions. And so I think if everything goes right, in theory, but again, once you start breaking that down and looking at how the enemy might respond, it can never really work.
I believe it was Sir Edward Grey who described the United States as a gigantic boiler and said there is no limit. Once lit, there's no limit to the amount of heat it can produce. What was the American contribution to the Allied victory from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's crucial. I mean, I think it allows a much greater efficiency of military support to be provided, but also, of course, making sure that the Italians can remain in the war, making sure the French can remain in the war, making sure the French can continue to produce because obviously a lot of the equipment the Americans have is produced by Britain and France, and so it allows that to sort of continue seamlessly, really, and also making sure that Britain can continue the war. So the economic impact is crucial. Naval impact is crucial. And I think sometimes it's been sort of underplayed by British historians just how important the American entry is. I think one of the problems that Brits have had is that we've spent so much time in our historiography trying to defend and actually talk about the excellence of the British Army by the end of the war that we want to claim all the credit for the victory for Britain. And in fact, you have to see it around. The Allies can't win without America.
And if by some weird throw of the dice, the Americans joined the Central Powers, became a German ally, because there was a significant German population here in the United States at the time, I'm assuming that would have ended the war as well, or put it on the path to ending more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much chance of that happening, but obviously, that would have been very, very decisive, I suppose. I guess the key kind of counterfactual of the 20th century is you combine Germany with the best army, Britain and the best navy, and American with the best economy, and you can conquer the world.
We have just a few more minutes left with author Nick Lloyd. We're discussing his book, The Western Front. Take us through in a general way, high level, but you talk about this, you concentrate about this on this in your book. 1918. The war ends in November of 18, but it's a slog. It's a close run thing, I believe, to use the Wellington term. How does 1918 start, and how do we get to armistice in November 11th, 1918?
Well, 1918 is really where things come full circle, where Germany can fight a one-front war, what it's been wanting to do since 1914. And so really it's a year of two halves, to use that footballing cliche. You have this massive German spring offensive, starts in late March, which, they put everything into it, and it's going to be the Kaiser's offensive, a war-winning offensive. They brought 1 million men across from the east after Russia's collapse. And they can strike, and they strike at the gap, or the sort of the junction between the British and French. They aim to roll the British up, and essentially what happens is they make huge gains, very successful but very, very costly offensives, and ultimately the Germans can't take that next operational leap. I suppose they can make gains, but eventually they begin to run out of steam, and they can't then restart things. So Germany mounts a number of other offensives up and down the front. Again, they usually have quite good initial success. They can go quite far, but eventually they run out of steam, and the Allies can bring in reserves. And then nowhere really do they truly threaten vital ground. There's some places where they get close, but they never quite do it. They get quite close to Amiens, which is a really important railway junction, Hazebrouck as well. But they never actually seem, and Ludendorff never really seems to know what exactly he's doing. Is he fighting the French? Is he fighting the British? Is he concentrating on the gap? Is he going for Hazebrouck? Is he going for the Channel ports? He tries a bit of everything, really. And essentially what happens is gradually the Germans slow down, and then the tide turns, and you have the Second Battle of the Marne, which is the counterattack in July. And that really kicks off the final phase of the war, where the Allies then go back onto the offensive. And in a number of attacks up and down the front at Amiens, on the Chemin de Damme, in Flanders, they gradually eat into the German army. And then at this point, the Germans begin to retreat. So they retreat to prepared position known as the Hindenburg Line. That's broken in late September. And from that point onwards, the war rapidly, comes to an end. And the Germans effectively then realize that the problem increasingly becomes the home front. And they might still be able to resist in the West. They can still cause the Allies casualties, but they can't really alter the strategic, balance. So the requirement then changes. The need is to keep some part of the army together that can hold on to prevent a Bolshevik uprising. So that's the kind of decision that Germany has to make by October, November, is that actually we are going to lose. And they're largely unimpressed, for example, with the Americans, but the Americans are only getting stronger, and they're going to be very, very strong in the spring of 1919. So if the war continues into 1919, it's only going to get worse. And so that's the year 1918. It's when things come full circle, and you have the culmination of everything that happened in the previous 4 years. So it is like that kind of 3-act tragedy in the Western Front. It does have that kind of balance, I think, which makes it quite an interesting historical topic to see, particularly when you see it in its entirety.
Is there an argument for Germany just to have remained on the defensive in 1918? They've got 1 million troops that they didn't have. They've got supplies and other resources coming in from the Eastern Front, which is now basically finished. Why didn't they just say, look, you're never, ever, ever, you don't have a single troop on German soil. You're never going to get here. It's only going to get worse for everybody. Let's just figure something out and not do Operation Michael, where they have this massive offensive.
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument I've made. I think if they do that and they hold firm in the West, they dig in and they make a serious peace offensive or diplomatic maneuver, then the Allies would have to respond. And I think, that's a very different scenario. But the way in which decision making is conducted in the German Empire at this point is, again, quite different from how it's done in the West. So on 11th of November 1917 is when the decision to attack in the West is taken. And there's about 4 or 5 people in the room: Hindenburg, Ludendorff, a couple of chief staff officers, no politician, not the Kaiser. No, there's just a military problem. They make a decision: we're going to go west. The question is, not about politics or about war aims or about diplomacy. The question is, should we attack on the Somme or the or the Ain? This is the kind of myopia of the German High Command. Is Ludendorff is focused on where am I going to break through, gets the maps out rather than the big strategic questions about what is the end goal here. The end goal is breaking the front, and then we will win. So that is the kind of chaotic nature of German decision making at this point. And ultimately, this logical idea about essentially banking your wins and leaving the casino is not taken. Ludendorff is a high roller. He will keep going. And ultimately, we know what happens. He comes out of the casino.
Busted.
He's thrown out.
I'll make a statement and you correct it or judge it. Great Britain and France never have fully recovered from the Great War.
Yes, probably. I mean, as much as, I think Britain shows an enormous ability and skill and sacrifice in the Second World War, it never has the same degree of power that it has in the First World War period.
Especially relative power when it comes to like the United States. And France?
Yeah, I mean, I think France suffers demographically as well. It struggles to recover from that psychologically. And I think there's arguments made that the psychological aspect of it is probably more crucial than economic issues or sheer blood costs. Because obviously Germany loses more. It loses more people, but also loses more proportionally as well. So, yeah, I mean, you can argue this all day long, but Germany comes out of it devastated in many ways, but with that sort of still that desire for revenge, whereas Britain and France simply do not want to go through that again. And I think it's that psychological aspect that's probably the most important.
Last question, or more of a request, a final thought, or hey, I didn't really know this about the war or about the war's participants until I spent years. Is there a discovery or a change of heart or mind in you, the author, that's the result of writing this book?
No, I mean, I think it wasn't necessarily a kind of light bulb moment or anything, but I think I had more respect for the French army, I think, than I learned through it. Actually, that was a key theme of mine, was how good they were, how good they became. The sacrifice of the French army was crucial, I think. And also the important role of the Americans, I think, which tends to be, as I mentioned, somewhat underplayed in the literature. I think that was crucial. And so it was very important to me to include those two elements, sort of emphasize those elements in the book, the important role of France and, the essential impact of American entry.
Forgive me, one last question. If you had been in charge at the end of 1918, would you have gone into the Netherlands and snatched up the Kaiser from Dorn?
Well, I mean, there were plenty of people wanting to do that and hang him. I mean, I guess it depends what troops you have available and whether, you want to invade a sovereign state. So I don't know. Maybe it could have been done. I think the problem is not necessarily the Kaiser. The bigger question would be whether you actually go into Germany. That would be probably, I'm quite happy to leave the Kaiser where he is. But actually invade Germany and then occupy Germany and break Germany up.
And that was a question that was clearly answered in World War II. We're not going to do this again. No. We're going to go in and leave no doubt.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I can understand why they didn't. But I think, obviously, with hindsight, I had the Allies carried on and actually used the Americans to actually go in and really, because that power vacuum very quickly becomes a big, big problem.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast sponsored by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, who, incidentally, is an American industrialist and philanthropist who died a few years ago at the age of 101. And P.E.'s first name was Pershing. He was born on August 30th, 1918. We miss you, PE. Our guest, Nick Lloyd, author of The Western Front, A History of the Great War, 1914-1918. There was so much we didn't get to talk about, but I'm incredibly grateful for your time, for doing this second podcast, and for the unfathomable effort that it took to write these books. Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd. I hope to have you on again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.